Great. Welcome, everyone, to the John Carter Brown Library and to this special lecture which inaugurates a special symposium. My name is Neil Safier, and I'm the director of the library. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's lecture by Professor Roger Chartier and the opening of the symposium entitled Merchants of the Printed Word, the Circulation and Commerce of Books in the Americas and Beyond. As some of you will have seen from the advertisement materials, the symposium is timed to celebrate the 475th anniversary of the introduction of the printing press to the Americas, Mexico, 1539, and has been organized by the library's Maury Bromson Curator of Latin American Books, Ken Ward. The symposium is the first programming foray in a new initiative at the library that we're calling New Worlds of the Book, which focuses on the impact of books and print in the wake of Columbus's arrival to the New World, and also the new ways in which digital technologies are changing the book as a medium and method of scholarship. We are, of course, building on what is a long and venerable tradition of bibliographical study here at the library, but the latest effort is meant to affirm the library as the preeminent center for the study of the history of the book in the Americas, since the JCB's collection has, since its consolidation in 1846, been dedicated to the history of all the Americas during the colonial period, and not exclusively the history of North American and, to some extent, European printing, like so many of its esteemed peer institutions. The breadth and diversity of this sort of new initiative is recognized in the lineup that we've prepared over the course of the next several days, which includes scholars from Brazil, Haiti, Peru, Belgium, the UK, Canada, Spain. We almost had somebody from Mexico, but she had to cancel, and scholarly interests ranging from the Caribbean to the Philippines. I'd like to take this opportunity, first of all, to welcome all of those scholars who have come here from those places to this event, and hopefully in the reception afterwards you'll have a chance to meet some of them as well. Indeed, this symposium intersects with another initiative here at the library, which emphasizes the place of the Americas in a global context. Books as border crossers, which is the title of a paper that I wrote some years ago for a different symposium, will always, I hope, play an important role in the academic programming and scholarly research of the library. On the topic of border crossers, one would be hard-pressed to find a more consummate passeur de frontières than Roger Chartier, professeur in the Collège de France and Annenberg visiting professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania. One would also be hard-pressed to find a more perfect keynote speaker for this symposium than Chartier, given his extraordinary achievements in the field of print culture, the history of cultural practices related to print and manuscript production, and the relationships between print and the scholarly traditions more broadly. His work in early modern European history, which is rooted in the traditions of the Annales School, has more recently focused on the relationship between written culture as a whole and literature, particularly for France, England, and Spain. But what is special about Professor Chartier's work is that it has never been disconnected from broader historiographical and methodological interests dealing with history and the other disciplines, be it philosophy, sociology, anthropology, or art history. This is very evident as I was looking through the list of a very long list of publications that Professor Chartier sent to me, and I was noticing that over the course of my own scholarly career, how many of those books in some way or another had an impact, but in very, very different ways. From the cultural origins of the French Revolution, which I read as a graduate student, to the usages of print, to the order of books, all the way up until his most recent publication, which we had the opportunity to discuss with Professor Chartier in the seminar this afternoon, The Author's Hand and the Printer's Mind, which will be coming out in French later on this year. Professor Chartier has far too many honors and prizes to enumerate here, too many doctor honoris causa commendations to list, and too many visiting professorships to count. However, I will emphasize the many visits, especially more recently, that Chartier has made to Latin America, with perhaps a focus on the Southern Cone, that is Argentina and Brazil, but also to places like the Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia in Mexico City, the University of Guadalajara, and others still. And so I think, as you will see, this connection with Latin America makes the topic of his talk tonight all the more of interest and relevance. His first time in Providence was to deliver the William F. Church Memorial Lecture in 1998, the same year he delivered the prestigious Panizzi Lectures at the British Library. Here tonight, at his first but hopefully not last lecture at the John Carter Brown Library, it gives us all great honor to have him here, and it gives me a particular satisfaction as a former student of his at the Johns Hopkins University and in his Paris seminar at the École des Hautes Études to have invited him here to deliver a lecture at the John Carter Brown Library for the first time. I also want to thank, in particular, some of the sponsors for this symposium and lecture, which include the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Gladys Kriebel-Delmas Foundation, as well as funding from our own Bromson and Rolker funds. I would also like to especially recognize Ken Ward, who worked hard to organize this symposium, and Nicole Wallace, our coordinator of academic programming, who's done a fantastic job of also organizing this, and the rest of the JCB staff who have really pitched in. On a personal note, I should also say that Professor Chartier is one of the most generous and humble scholars of his stature that I have ever met on this continent or beyond, and those who were present at the seminar that he gave to Brown faculty and students this afternoon will undoubtedly agree. All of these reasons add to my pleasure in welcoming Professor Chartier to Brown and to the JCB to deliver the lecture, The 7 Lives of Las Casas, Brevissima Relacion. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank Neil for his invitation and, of course, for this too generous introduction. And it is an honor for me to deliver this inaugural or keynote lecture for this very promising conference. And also, it's a great pleasure to be, as you have recalled, to be here for the second time, at least at Brown University, if not at the John Carter Library. It's really with these two feelings I will start this lecture. Las Casas, Brevissima Relacion de la Destrucción de las Indias is a paradigmatic case of these works that crossed frontiers, circulated in various languages, moved from one discursive genre to another, and received different or contradictory meanings in different times and places. By dedicating this lecture to its successive lives between 1552 and 1822, I would like to pay tribute to two great scholars who wrote on Las Casas and whose memory and books are present in the two institutions where I am currently teaching, as recalled by Neil. Henry Charles Lee, whose library is now at the University of Pennsylvania, and who published in 1899 in the Yale Review a Lascasian article entitled The Indian Policy of Spain. And of course, Marcel Bataillon, professor at the Collège de France, who collected in his book Études sur Bartolomé de las Casas, published in 1965, several fundamental essays devoted to the Dominican. Last but not least, I must indicate that my research was quite entirely based on the Las Casas editions belonging to the library constituted by the Philadelphian collector Robert Deckert and donated to the University of Pennsylvania in 1960. I would like to thank John Pollack, one of the librarians of the rare book collection of the Library of the University of Pennsylvania, who wrote an article on Robert Deckert for his passion and learned help. For understanding the successive interpretation and appropriation of Las Casas' famous work, I propose to divide its history into 7 successive lives. The first life is well known. It locates the Brevissima Relacion within the publication in Seville in 1552 of 9 tratados, treatises, tracts written by Las Casas during the previous 10 years. The the library at the University of Pennsylvania possesses 2 volumes where the 9 tracts are bound together, and for one of them, a manuscript continuous foliations. The title page proposed a strong contrast of the Brevissima Relacion between, on the one hand, the centrality of the coat of arms of the Emperor Charles V and the reference to his motto, Plus Ultra, first used by Charles as a chivalric motto in 1516, and then designating the sovereignty of the King of Castile on the world situated beyond the Hercules columnas. And on the other hand, the absence of on the title page and in the book itself of any licenses or approbaciones and privilege. The reason could be either that Las Casas wanted to avoid the regular mechanisms of censorship delegated in Seville to the Archbishop of the city, or that a tacit protection had been given for the publication by the Prince Philip, the future Philip II, who was in charge of the Indies and who favorably welcomed Las Casas when he came back to Spain in 1547, when he would stay until his death in 1566. In any case, the brevity of the tracts did not exempt them from censorship, since the law of July 8, 1502, on the printing and selling of books in Spain required a license for all the book, I quote, whatever the quality might be, whether large or small, in Latin or Romance. The title page indicated also the reason for the text's credibility. It is a relacion, a genre that implies generally the testimony of eyewitnesses. It has been written by a Dominican. Las Casas joined the order in 1523, who became bishop. Las Casas was consecrated Bishop of Chiapas in 1544, but resigned in 1550. And its author claims to belong to a Sevillan noble family, the Casas. That is a useful addition at a time when aristocratic testimonies were considered more likely to be true because held as disinterested. The name of the printer did not appear on the title page, but the colophon indicates that the work was printed in Sevilla and Casa de Sebastián Trujillo. The text in 1552, published in 1552, had been written by Las Casas 10 years earlier. I quote the translation. I completed it on the 8th of December of 1542, when Las Casas came to Spain to convince the emperor to reform the 1513 laws of Burgos that govern the Spanish policy in America. According to Las Casas, it was urgent to suppress 3 institutions: the encomienda, that recommended Indians to a Spanish master who must teach them the Christian faith in exchange for forced labor in fields and mines; the repartimiento, or distribution of Indians between encomenderos, that destroyed Indian communities and families; and the requerimiento, that was a legal fiction according to which the Indians willingly adopted the Christian faith and swore obedience to the crown of Castile, and if not, could be justly punished. For Las Casas, these 3 institutions had in fact produced the enslavement of the Indians, allowed the worst cruelties perpetrated by the conquistadors, and led to the destruction of the Indies, that is to say, the radical depopulation of the New World. I quote from the modern English translation, "The despotic and diabolical behavior of the Christians has over the last 40 years led to the unjust and totally unwarranted death of more than 12 million souls, women and children among them, and there are grounds for believing my own estimate of more than 15 million to be near the mark." Such a situation was dangerous to the king, whose authority was challenged by feudal encomenderos who had appropriated the land and who had ruined the monarch by devastating and depopulating the islands and the mainland that had been conquered in his name. In 1542, the Brevissima Relacion, 10 years before the publication, reflected the crisis of Spanish colonization, the atrocities committed by the conquistadors that deprived their victim of the salvation promised by the true faith and sent their perpetrators to an eternal punishment, led to a questioning of the legitimacy of Spanish sovereignty over the New World. In 1493, the Pope had transmitted to the King of Castile and the King of Portugal the sovereignty over the Newfound lands in the Atlantic. The theologians of the University of Salamanca, and particularly Francisco de Vitoria, opposed to the legitimacy of such potestas, arguing for the Thomist philosophy of natural law that recognized the sovereignty of indigenous prince, and as a consequence asserted that the wars against the Indians and the sovereignty of the conquerors must be founded on just titles. In 1552, 10 years after, when he published his Tratados, Las Casas was a disappointed man. His project of a peaceful and missionary colonization that began in 1537 in Guatemala, in the Tierra de Guerra that became the Verapaz, had failed. In his diocese of Chiapas, where he arrived in 1544, the conflict with the inhabitants and the local authorities was permanent and violent. In 1547, the monarch has repealed the law and ordinances proclaimed 5 years earlier, the Leyes Nuevas, inspired for a part by Las Casas, leyes that prohibited slavery and freed the enslaved Indians, laws who forbade new repartimientos, laws which suppressed the encomiendas owned by royal officers, monasteries, hospitals, confraternities, and law that organized the progressive disappearance of the encomiendas. Finally, his dispute with Sepulveda in Valladolid in 1550 had remained inconclusive. Las Casas, however, had not abandoned the project to send missionaries who would substitute peaceful conversion for brutal enslavement. In Seville, in 1552, his task was twofold. On the one hand, it was urgent to give to the 21 Dominicans who would leave for Chiapas the text they would need for their mission. They would bring with them the tratados justifying the suppression of the encomienda, the octavo remedio, and justifying the abolition of slavery, and also the tratado teaching them the rules for confession of the encomenderos who were obliged to repent and restore what they have unjustly taken, the tratados of which the title is Avisos y Reglas para los Confesores. At the same time, this missionary should employ the arguments he had made, Las Casas, in opposition to Sepulveda in favor of the natural right of the Indians and the legitimate sovereignty of their princes. A natural sovereignty that the universal sovereignty of the King of Spain should respect, as the emperor did with the European monarchs. On the other hand, Las Casas tried once again to convince the Prince Philip and the Emperor Charles to declare the necessary reforms because time was running out. In 1552, Las Casas Brevissima took on a prophetic, an apocalyptical cast. by destroying the Indians by forced labor, excessive tribute payments and massacres, and by inflicting on them the most terrible tortures, the Spanish had gravely offended God. But his vengeance would be terrible. The sin of the Spaniards were also the sin of their prince, and all were threatened with eternal damnation. The destruction of the Indies announced the imminent destruction of Spain itself. It was the reason why Las Casas wrote and then printed his warning. I quote, "I do not wish to see my country destroyed as a divine punishment for sins against the honor of God and the true faith. Por compasión que he de mi patria, que es Castilla, no la destruya Dios por tan grandes pecados contra su fe y honra." A second life was given to the Brevissima by its appropriation by its first Protestant translations, in Dutch in 1578, in French in 1579, and in English in 1583. As indicated by the title page of the French translation, printed at Antwerp, and by the address to the reader in the English one, the context of the publication and reception of this translation was profoundly different from the context of the writing in 1542 and the publication in 1552 of the text in Spain. In January 1579, the 7 Calvinist provinces of the northern Low Countries has formed the Union of Utrecht to defend their religious identity against the tyranny of a foreign sovereign, the King of Spain. The intention behind the translation of Las Casas' work is clear: pour servir d'exemple et d'avertissement aux 17 provinces du Pays-Bas, or in the English version, 1583, to serve as a precedent and warning to the 17 provinces of the Low Countries. Recalling the crimes committed by the Spaniards in America was a way to alert all who might be tempted to come to an agreement with the Spaniards in the Low Countries. Rhode, the Protestant translator, gave 2 reasons for publishing his translation dedicated to all the provinces of the Low Country. I quote. The one, I quote from the English translation of 1583, which is translating the French text by Rhode, and also the Spanish text translated by the same Rhode in French, now translated in English. The one, first reason, that awakening themselves out of their sleep, they may begin, the inhabitants of the Low Country, to think upon God's judgments and refrain from their weakness and vice. The other, that they may also consider with what enemy they are to deal, and so to behold, as it were, in a picture or table, what they are like to be at, when through their recklessness, quarrels, controversies, and partialities themselves, the inhabitants of the Low Countries, has opened the way to such an enemy and what they may look for. In Rhode translation, and then in the English translation, the destruction of the Indies, which for Las Casas prefigured that of Spain, announced the possible destruction of the Low Countries if their inhabitants did not deeply reform themselves and remain only réformés que de bouche, and if they did not unite against so arrogant an enemy. This new context explains the transformation of the title, Tyrannie et cruauté des Espagnols, which is reproduced, if not on the title page of the English translation, the Spanish colony, but at least in the advice to the reader. Cruelties are opposed to the natural and Christian morals that require the pursuit of common good. Tyrannies belong to the political vocabulary of the time and designates the arbitrary disposition of their property or lives of their subject by despotic powers that such the Ottomans do not respect neither natural nor divine law. The emphasis is put on the title page to the Spanishness of a text that can be believed because it is a brief chronicle written in the Castilian language by a Spaniard and faithfully translated. A last effect of the political intention of the translation or translations in French and into French and into English is to define the book as a collection of Las Casas' text, adding to the translation of the Brevissima 4 other tratados printed in 1552. The Missive, an anonymous letter narrating other cruelties committed by the Spaniards, added to the Brevissima, some extract of the Eighth Remedy, where it is proved that the Indians must not be given to the Spaniard en encomienda, ni en feudo, ni en vasallaje, ni de otra manera ninguna, the prologue to the probatory treaty addressed to the prince, and the summary of the dispute between Las Casas and Sepulveda. The majority of the following translations and editions of the Brevissima in various languages will appropriate this additional content from the French and English translation without any variations. In England, the publication of the Spanish colony cannot be separated from the numerous pamphlets that during the 1580s use the same rhetoric as Las Casas' translation. In 1582, William Broome, the publisher of the Spanish colony the year after, has published the translation of a French pamphlet printed by Plantin in Antwerp, stigmatizing, I quote, the vile and devilish assault committed upon the person of the most noble Prince William of Orange. In 1583, a tragical history of the trouble and civil war of the Low Country, written by Thomas Stocker, used the same vocabulary as the Spanish colony to denounce, I quote, the barbarous cruelties and tyrannies of the Spaniards and treacherous Hispanioized Walloons. Later, in 1590, the copy of the anti-Spaniard made at Paris by a Frenchman Catholic, in this case Antoine Arnaud, used the same device as Las Casas' translation by publishing French Catholic writing that condemned the intervention of the Spaniard and the French allies in the French wars of religion. In London, the publication of the English translation of Migrod's translation was particularly relevant given the fear of the Spanish invasion of England, both before and after the invincible, also actually vanquished, Armada. The 17th engravings added by Theodore de Brie to his Latin translation of the Breuissima, entitled Narratio Regionum Indicarum per Hispanos, gave a third life to Las Casas' work. Publishing the text gathered together in the 1578-79 edition, the book visualized the most horrifying of the cruelties described in the text. Tormented, mutilated, killed, the Brie Indians became modern version of the martyr. The slaughter recalls the massacre of the innocents. The torture, those of the saints. Their sufferings, those of Christ, flagellated, humiliated, crucified. These images play an essential role in creating a potent image of Spain as itself savage and barbarous. The brief series of 17 plates were published in the context of a war of images between Protestants and Catholics. They responded to another series of 29 engravings published in 1587 in Antwerp, the city that had become a Catholic bastion, by Richard Verstegen. These engravings were accompanied by a text in Latin in the first edition and the French translation the following year, under the title of Theatrum Crudelitatum Hereticorum Nostri Temporis. These engravings were made by an English Catholic in exile and put on the market in the period between the execution of Mary Stuart and the preparation for the invincible Armada. They showed the violent acts committed by Protestants in England, the Low Countries, and France. Far from inviting viewers to share the blessed faith of the victims, as was the case with images of martyred saints, Verstegen's engravings were an appeal to vengeance against a cruel and barbarous enemy. In his iconographic response, Debris did not show the cruelties of the Catholics in Europe. His maneuver was to substitute the Indians for the Reformed Protestants and to point to violence in the New World to show to all Europe the abominable cruelties perpetrated there by the Spaniards as reminder, as warning of the atrocity they had had or could exercise against Protestant peoples and nations. Probably based on the watercolor illustration that accompany a manuscript of Migraud's translation prepared for a 1582 New Parisian edition of the translation and published but without any illustration, a series of watercolor illustrations that now belong to the William Clements Library at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. These 17 engravings had a wide and twofold circulation. On the one hand, they entered into the new edition of the German and Dutch translations. Debris had published in 1597 a German translation of the text with the title of Neue Welt, but without any illustration. The new edition of the book in 1599, present in the collection of this library, incorporated the image of the Latin translation published 1 year before. These images were also introduced in the numerous Dutch editions published at the beginning of the 17th century in Amsterdam, and the library is particularly rich in these materials, published by Cornelis Claes in 1609 and 1610, by Lodewijk van der Plasse in 1620, 21, 23, 1634, and by John Everts Kloppenburg in 1620 and 1638. On the other hand, as early as 1599, 1 year after the Latin translation and its illustrations, the 17 engravings were printed separately by Debris with legends in German that quoted the passage of the text illustrated by the image, one image plus text on each page. In 1620, in Amsterdam, Jan Kloppenburg made explicit the implied parallel suggested by Debris by showing in the same book, Miroir de la tyrannie espagnole, there exists also a Dutch version, that the cruelties perpetrated in the Low Countries were reflecting those perpetrated in the West Indies, as related by Las Casas. Adorned with copperplate engravings, the book opens with an address au lecteur that traced a parallel between the unjust religious argument the Spaniards used for justifying their just war, with quotation mark, against the Indians, whom they claim were pagans, idolatrous, calling up the devil and dishonest people, païens, idolâtres, invoqués de diable, gens inhonnêtes et sans raison, and against the same or parallel arguments against the inhabitants of the United Provinces, whom they denounce as heretics, Lutheran, disobedient to their king of Spain, hérétiques, luthériens, inobédients à leur roi d'Espagne. The two series of engravings, each of them accompanied by 8 lines of verse, embodied in a spectacular manner the lesson of the book. I quote, "I beg you, reader, to read it and reread it so that you can flee the tyranny and take arms against such tyrants who want to tyrannize everywhere." Je te prie, lecteur, de le lire et relire afin que tu puisses fuir la tyrannie et prendre les armes contre tels tyrans voulant tyranniser partout. In the different form of their circulation, Debris' engravings played an essential role in the construction of what, at the beginning of the 20th century, Julián Juderías called, while opposing it, the Spanish leyenda negra. Their impact must not, however, hide the importance of the images previously introduced by Debris in another book, the 3 volumes of the Latin edition of Benzoni's Historia del Mundo Nuevo, published in Frankfurt in 1594, 95, and 96, for the 3 volumes. Different aspects of European politics led to the appropriation of Las Casas' book in the first half of the 17th century, and this for its 4th life. The work was published in 3 Venetian editions in 1626, 1630, 1643, under the title of Historia o brevissima relazione della distruzione delle Indie Occidentali. All these editions had the same translator, Giacomo Castellani, the same printer, Marco Ginami, the same layout, with 2 columns giving the Spanish text in Roman type and the Italian translation in italics, and the same content, the publication of the Brevissima only. The preface, dell'utilità di questa storia ai lettori, gives the reason for this edition of the text. Beyond the emotion produced by, I quote, translating, the most tragic, the most horrible history on the great stage of the world ever seen, which will certainly move all those whose heart is not harder than a rock, there is a specific political motive. The target of Castellani and Ginami is the papacy as much as the cruel Spaniard. I quote, "The popes will see how, with the excuse of the just donation of the Indies made by their predecessors to the King of Castile, provided that they converted the Indian to the faith of Christ, thousands and millions of souls have been thrown into the abyss of hell." The publication of the destruction of the Indies, like the edition of 2 other Las Casas Tratados, translated into Italian in 1636 and 1644, as Il Supplice Schiavo Indio, which is a translation of the treatise Sobre la materia de los indios que se han hecho en las Indias esclavos, and as Conquista del Indie, which is an extract of the dispute with Sepúlveda, must be located, these 3 publications, with 3 editions for each of them, must be located within the context of the antagonism between Venice and the papacy, an antagonism that began with the interdict of 1606, when the Republic was excommunicated, and was followed by diplomatic and military tension between the Republic of Venice and the Spanish Viceroy of Naples between 1617 and 1622. The Lascasian corpus became, in this context, a polemical weapon, and it is not by chance that some readers put the 3 texts into the same binding as shown by a copy in the Deckert collection at the University of Pennsylvania. The only Spanish edition of the 17th century gives another example of political appropriation of the Brevissima. It was printed in Barcelona in 1646. 5 Lascasian Tratados are put together in a book for which the approbatio and licencia was given by a Dominican, like Las Casas himself, at the request of the Vicar General of Barcelona. The list of the titles given on the title page changed the original title for 3 out of 5 works by adding the word Castellanos in the first work, Brevissima Relacion de la Destrucción de las Indias Occidentales por los Castellanos, and in the fourth, Un Tratado sobre la Materia de los Indios que se han hecho esclavos por los Castellanos, and by erasing the reference to León in the second Tratado, in which the kings are only Reyes de Castilla. In this context, the word Castellano, Castilian, is no more an equivalent or synonym of Spanish, as in Covarrubias' Diccionario de la Lengua Castellana o Española, published in 1611, but rather it designates the Castilian and not the other people of Spain, and particularly not the Catalans, as the only ones to be guilty for the cruelties committed in the Indies. Las Casas is thus enrolled by the Catalans in their war against Philip IV and Olivares that had begun with the uprising of the Segadors, or Reapers, in Barcelona in June 1640, and had led Pau Claris and the Junta de Brazo, la Generalitat, to proclaim in January 1641 the independence of the Republic of Catalonia and to ally with Louis XIII, who became Count of Barcelona. Las Casas Obras in 1646, among them La Brevissima, was published in the midst of a war of sieges between the Catalan insurgents and their French allies and the Spanish armies. In this situation, the Catalans become a new figure of the Indians because they are victims, as the Indians were, of the Castilian tyranny. The fifth life of the Brevissima comes from 1656, when the text was made English by John Phillips, Milton's nephew, who 30 years later would publish a new translation of Don Quixote. The Tratado received a new title, The Tears of the Indians, perhaps inspired by James Cranford's The Tears of Ireland, published in 1642 as a relation of the Papist massacre of the Irish Protestants. And it is, according to the title page, illustrated with pictures that imitated in reduced form selected debris engravings, no longer printed together with the text or within the text, but rather as a fold-out insertion added when the book was bound, and not necessarily added in every copy. In Phillips' translation, the Indian tears are biblical tears. I quote, "Never had we so just a cause to exclaim in the words of the prophet Jeremiah, oh, that our heads were waters, and our eyes fountains of tears, that we might weep for the effusion of so much innocent blood, which is the blood of Christ." The text was published as an historical and true account of the cruel massacre and slaughters of above 20 millions of innocent people, according to the title page. Phillips has three aims with this new translation, retranslating the text already translated in 1583, but from the French translation. First, to praise the dedicatee, His Highness Oliver, Lord Protector of the Commonwealth, who is praised as a new David, a new Joshua, destined, I quote, to cut off the idolater from the earth. The publication of the Spanish cruelties will allow, I quote, all good men to see and applaud the justness of your proceedings, being confident that God, who has put this great design into your hands, will also be pleased to give it a signal blessing. The second aim, made explicit by the advice to all true Englishmen, is a call to revenge the blood of the innocent Indian, but also and more to fight not against your countrymen, I quote, but against your old and constant enemies, the Spaniards, a proud, deceitful, and treacherous nation whose chiefest aim has been the conquest of this land and to enslave the people of this nation. Last, John Phillips affirms the right of the English to the West Indies and recalls Cabot's discovery under Henry VII and, I quote, the poor spirits of our English kings who were not able to make profit of this discovery and consequently are, I quote, as to be almost guilty of the blood shed in those parts. The Spaniard, according to John Phillips, is weaker than it seems, and if England chases him from his Indian treasures, I quote, he would soon retire to his shell like a snail tapped upon the horns. Las Casas relations show that the Spanish Christians are more barbarous than the Turks, and that the Indians are like primitive Christians killed by the cruelties of the Roman emperors. Their souls, deprived of eternal salvation, wait for a redeemer. I quote, "Yet methinks I hear a sudden stillness among them, the cry of blood ceasing, at the noise of your great transactions, Cromwell's, while you are armed for their revenge." In John Phillips' reading of Las Casas, English political interests are inseparable from the divine mission given by God to the Lord Protector. At the end of the 17th century, a cluster of 3 new editions gave to Las Casas text a new and unexpected meaning, a sixth life. Published in Paris in 1697, translated by Morvan de Bellegarde, also author of a famous treatise of civility, and dedicated to the Count of Toulouse, one of the Louis XIV's illegitimate sons, the text received a new title, La découverte des Indes occidentales. Without any mention of destruction or tears in its title page, with the running title of Voyage des Espagnols dans les Indes, with a peaceful frontispiece showing the civil encounter between Cortés and Moctezuma, the book belongs now to the genre of the travelogues, which narrated discoveries, journeys, and marvelous possessions. I quote, "You will see the description of the most beautiful, the most fertile, and the happiest country in the world, where God has given gold, silver, pearls, emeralds, and an infinity of other precious goods to peoples who did not care about them, and that the Europeans go for amidst so many perils." Such a description would perhaps lead the young prince, he was 18 at the time, to desire to travel there and to command the king's navy. But the publisher was conscious that Las Casas or refined narrations do not fit easily within the genre of the travelogue. It is the reason why the avertissement indicates in different places we have softened things which seemed too cruel and which could have saddened sensitive persons. On a adouci en quelques endroits des choses qui paraissaient trop cruelles et qui auraient pu faire de la peine aux personnes délicates. The following year, a pirated edition in Amsterdam reproduced, pirated according to the French perception of this, reproduced the French text with the same dedicatory epistle and the same frontispiece under the title of Relacion des voyages et des découvertes que les Espagnols ont fait dans les Indes occidentales. The Dutch publisher Jean-Louis Delorme, however, thought it necessary to address a preface to the reader in which he declared that, I quote, "It will seem curious that such a book that condemned vehemently religious violence has been published in France, where persecution has lasted for so long a time." And he brought back the text both to its origins and to the contemporary events, recalling that the arguments used by Sepulveda for persecuting the Indians are more or less the same as those used recently against the Protestants in France, and that the replies by Las Casas use the same argumentation as the one presented by the Protestants against l'esprit de persécution. Nevertheless, the translation is mainly presented as an interesting travelogue. I quote, "The known countries of America are so well described that it is sure that the book will be read with pleasure." Las Casas text is published with another travelogue, La Relacion curieuse des voyages du Sieur de Montauban, a captain of pirates whose journey along the coast of Guinea was, I quote, "an extraordinary adventure." The two texts are printed with continuous signature and continuous pagination as if they were addressed to the same horizon of expectations. In the copy owned by the Library of Pennsylvania, they were bound with a third text, also published by Delorme, L'art de voyager utilement, that confirms this new reception of Las Casas as a writer of voyage. This edition, published in its new dress in modern French, was translated in London in 1698, with two different title pages for the same editions. It kept something of the new perception of the text by adding the art of traveling to Las Casas' writings, which here consists not only of the Brevissima, but also of 7 other texts that are translations of some letters or extract of his other tratados. But at the same time, the English edition mentions on its title page, I quote, the destruction of above 40 millions of people, and it is accompanied by 2 fold-out leaves of engravings, one of 16 images, the other of 6, at least in the copy I have seen at the University of Pennsylvania, because the copy here has not the engraving, which is what is the consequence of these or texts, which are not printed on the same page than the text, but added or not to the book in the process of its binding. So these images both drastically simplify the Breuiss's illustration in a very crude manner, and at the same time use them as a kind of iconographical index by associating a single image not only with one page of the text, but with all the different passages in the book which narrate the same cruel act. For example, the Indian devoured by the dogs of the Spaniards. This English edition attempts also to excise any Catholic dimension of the text. I quote, "What the bishop says here and there in favor of his own religion is so weak that it would be unnecessary to confute any of those popish fancies in this preface." But for the editor, Las Casas' Relacion, or relation, is more than this popery, as stigmatized in the title of another English translation published in 1689, "Popery truly displayed in its bloody colors." For the 1698 edition, the Bishop of Chiapas was not this pope, adept of popery, but was, in a certain sense, a precursor of the new values embodied by the Glorious Revolution and the Lockean philosophy. I quote, "It may well surprise the reader to hear a Spanish prelate declaiming so loudly against persecution and plead so freely for liberty of conscience in a country subjugated to the Inquisition, and to hear him assert the natural right of all mankind to liberty and property, and inveigh against all usurpation in tyranny in the smartest terms. All may serve to convince one how great an advantage or disadvantage a man has as he pleads the cause of truth or error, and of the great difference there is between the genuine language of reason and good sense and the servile prejudices of bigotry and superstition. Liberty of conscience, right to property, language of reason, common sense. If this were indeed the language of Las Casas, no one could accuse the Catholic bishop of being popish at all. Of course, the preface continues, Las Casas was wrong to accept the authority of the Pope, but this bishop writes with such an air of honesty, sincerity, and charity, as he would very well have become one of a better religion than that in which he had the unhappiness to be educated. He deserved, in fact, Las Casas, to be a Protestant, and without knowing it, he was really more English than Spanish. I quote, "The principle of the Bishop of Chiapas concerning property and liberty, both civil and religious, are more agreeable to the genius and constitution of this island than to the present temper of that part of the continent which lies nearest to it." The last metamorphosis of the Brevissima and of its seventh life occurred at the beginning of the 19th century. In the 1880s and 1820s, in the midst of the wars of independence opposing the Spanish colonies to their metropolis, the work was reedited many times and for the first time in the Americas, in Bogota in 1813, Cadix 1820, Puebla 1821, Mexico and Guadalajara 1822, and also in London and Philadelphia in 1821. The Guadalajara edition emphasizes this new geography of the work, following and recalling all the previous edition of this work, now transformed into an appeal for American liberty, of which Las Casas is now proclaimed the prophet and the saint. At the end of his discurso preliminar, Dr. Don Servando de Mier addressed his fellow Americans, I quote, "If you become free, as I am sure you will, the first statue you should erect must be devoted to the first defender of freedom in America. It is around this statue that you will unite you and sing your hymns to freedom, since no incense can be more agreeable to him. Myself, I shall write this inscription, 'Traveler, stop here if you love virtue.' This statue is its image. Worship Casas, who was the father of our Indian." I give the original text. "Si sois libres, como yo no le dudo, la primera estatua debe erigirse al primero y más antiguo defensor de la libertad en América. Alrededor de ella formad vuestros pactos y entonad a la libertad vuestros cánticos. Ningún incienso puede ser lo más grato. Yo le pondría esta semejante inscripción: para, si amas la virtud, pasajero, esta es su imagen. Venera a Casas, que fue de nuestros indios el padre." Paradoxically, the criollos, descendants of the conquistadors and encomenderos, here became the American natives, claiming the rights of the first inhabitants. As the Indians were 300 years before, they are now threatened by the guerra a muerte imposed by the Spanish generals and soldiers who, I quote, "have repeated and are repeating the tragic scenes of the conquest." But the Creoles will win this time, and so perhaps Las Casas' prophecy, I quote, about the end of the Spanish Empire in the Indies is about to come true. The two volumes of Las Casas' œuvres or obras, published in French and Spanish in Paris in 1822 by Juan Antonio Llorente, mark a turning point. One edition in French was published by Emery in Paris, and the other one by Rosa, who was a publisher specialized in the market for Latin America. The two volumes, more or less similar in French and in Spanish, contain a biography of the author, the edition of 5 tratados, among them the Brevissima Relacion, and unpublished manuscripts, particularly found in the Bibliothèque Royale in Paris, and several letters and memoirs concerning the controversial position of Las Casas about the necessity to bring African slaves in the New World. In his preface, Llorente addressed 2 difficulties. First, how to use Las Casas' text for justifying the rights not of the Indians, whose the unjust dispossession Las Casas has described, but of the heirs of the conquistadors who destroyed them. His answer is that, I quote, "In some circumstances, the return to the previous order is impossible, even when it would be desirable to repair completely the wrongs done to those who have suffered so much. Alas, to erase the usurpation is impossible, and consequently, I quote Llorente, it is today without any importance that those denounced as tyrants by Las Casas were Europeans, because their descendants acquired the title that Las Casas claimed in favor of the native people. The second difficulty was the accusation launched against Las Casas for having established the trade of African slaves in the New World. The accusation was founded on the Memorial de Remedios para las Indias written by Las Casas in 1516 during his first return to Spain, trying to convince the king at the time, Ferdinand of Aragon, that the reform was necessary in the island after his own conversion, listening to the sermon of Montesinos and reading the Bible. In this memorial, Las Casas mentioned the possibility that each community constituted by Spanish peasants and Indians, and substituted to the encomiendas, could receive 20 African slaves to work in the fields and the mines. Las Casas, as we know, acknowledged later his mistake, considering it as an unforgivable moral fault, and it expressed his repentance in his Historia de las Indias. But the text was not published before 1875, and it was not known by the author of the 18th century. Llorente mentioned Depew or Robertson, who, following Herrera as they have read, Herrera, who knew the royal chronicler of the Indies, who knew Las Casas' manuscript because he could read it in the archives in L'Escorial, where Philip II has asked that the manuscript written by Las Casas were transported in 1571. So, following Herrera, Depew and Robertson accused Las Casas of being at the origin of the slave trade between Africa and America. Llorente refuted the accusation by quoting and publishing the argument against this view developed previously by Abbé Grégoire in his Apologie de Las Casas, read in Paris at the Institut National on May 12, 1800. Llorente edition was, we see, at the same time, a vibrant plea for the cause of the criollos, a defense of Las Casas against the critics who, wrongly, according to him, stigmatized him, using in an erroneous manner this mention in Herrera of this manuscript of 1516. And finally, this edition was also a scholarly book that opened up Las Casian studies to a new age of interpretation, of editing, and reuse of the Tratado printed in Seville in 1552. But for this evening, it will be the last one of the successive lives of the Destrucción de las Indias. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger, for that extraordinary and magisterial arc history that encompasses so much of what is contained within this library, and I think speaks to the possibility of doing this kind of research here and the importance and relevance of moving between the 16th century and the 18th and 19th century interpretations. We have some time for questions. I'm sure there are many different questions. I should also say that when we have the lecture online, I think what we can do is also do a mini exhibit online of, at the very least, the frontispieces, as well as some of the engravings, which will allow people to have a visual sense of some of the dramatic arguments that Professor Chartier was making.
I've seen I'm not fanatic with a PowerPoint, and I still remain faithful to the exphrases to create image with Word, but it doesn't work every time. So it would be good in this second version to have all the title page, because we have all the books. You have all the books I have quoted here.
Thank you, Professor, for a wonderful lecture. I was particularly struck by the 5th and 6th slides and the geopolitical parallels of England and France desiring at those moments to take over part of the Caribbean.
Yeah.
And so my question was, regarding the 5th life, the English translation at the time when Cromwell is very much planning to take over Cuba, you know, he gets something, he gets Jamaica. And I wondered what circulation that edition had in the other British colonies in the Americas.
Frankly, I don't know. It's research to have to do. I have no idea. It would be necessary to answer either to look at the provenance of other copies of this edition in various libraries, particularly not only in America, but in the States, but also perhaps in some country of Latin America. And also to try to find in other kind of sources if there is any mention of this translation. When there is only one edition, because my knowledge it's only one edition, of course it's a limited number of copies which are available. We can suppose that generally 1,500 copies, no more. Is the reason why it's so impressive to follow the Dutch translation, because with this written of more than quite 40 editions during the same period, you can imagine the circulation of this text. And as Dutch was not necessarily a universal language, the intensity of the reading within the large country and of this text. I have no answer. I suppose it would be a very good question to be addressed to people working on this other part of the circulation of the text, but. I don't know. The text has this ambiguity, ambivalence. On the one hand, is open to the colonization by the English of other parts of the world in this kind of competition with the Spanish and the Portuguese. At the same time, it's deeply rooted in this biblical interpretation of the Cromwellian politics. And so he has this deep dimension of the context of the Civil War. But of course, it could be used also as an argument for the claim, a colonial claim in a sense. But I don't know. Some people know, yeah, it's possible. If they have found this 1656 edition in the library where they are not necessarily expected. Yes?
I have a question about concerning the practices of binding text together, text and images. Do we know whether these choices were made by printers in shops, or whether they were actually done in private in the context of private library collections? What do we know?
It's a very interesting question, because there are two first, a first distinction. We can be absolutely certain that two texts were thought as compatible and belonging to the same publishing strategy, corresponding, at least in the mind of the publisher, to the same horizon of expectation, when the two texts, even they have two title pages, are printed continuously. That is to say, with a continuous pagination, and more important, with the continuous series of signature. You know, the letter at the bottom of the page for associating in the right order the different quires. In this case, the idea to put together two texts and what it could mean to do this belongs to the publisher. The other form, I suppose you were mentioning that, and when in a book today, in a library, we find together in the same binding texts which were clearly printed separately. And in this sense, the question is when and by whom. First, we have an indication if we are able to date the binding, because it could be 16th century or someone in the 19th century, a collector, for example, who decided that some things have to be put together. The first indication, to date the binding. And second indication, to try to imagine if it was the, I suppose that in this case, is the owner of the text was asked for a binding of the different 2 or 3 works in the same binding. And as so, we have to decipher and why this was be done. It could be done because the reader, owner, has the perception that these texts are constituting a small homogeneous library and could be put together. Sometimes it could be for more practical reason without necessarily textual intention. But I think the first hypothesis is, in general, the more important. There is a wonderful essay by Armando Petrucci about this, because the question was raised since the time of the first codices, what you put together in the same book. And we hear the ambiguity, ambivalence, or peril of the word book. If book designates a work, the book by Niels Safier, or if a book designates an object, and we have the natural tendency to think that there is the equivalence, it's the same thing. But many books are several works. And so this essay by Petrucci was discussing, one, what he called unorganic miscellanies, when in the Middle Ages people were putting together texts which have nothing to do one with the other, except that they were owned by the same person and wanted to have all these texts in the same binding, or organic miscellany, that is to say there is a principle of unity, which could be the users of this text, which could be the common topic and subject. And this distinction, we could use it for the world of the printed text, and which could also be an important element for the construction of the concept of authorship, in a sense that the miscellany could erase or dissolve the unity of the authorship when the text bound together belong to the different different author, or when what is bound in the same book are the work by the same author. And it's another fundamental distinction in the late Middle Ages for the birth, perhaps the first birth of the author function, to speak like Foucault, when for some writer like Pétrarque or Christine de Pizan or René d'Anjou, the owner decided to put in the same codex work only by the same author, and not, as the tradition for the text in vernacular was, miscellany with different authors, and there was no authorial function in this case. In this first movement of binding the author with himself or with herself was a form of a material form for giving identity to the author function. And here too, we could look at the book in the library with the same question of the preeminence or primacy of a proper name, which constitutes the principle of unity of this multi-text volume, or if, for other reason, the users of the text, for example, this principle of authorship is not decisive or fundamental. And so, yes, it's another reason to think that to work in the library is fundamental, even if you can read the text on the screen of a computer, because only this relation with the materiality of the object could raise and perhaps to answer the question you utter.
Great. Well, we're probably going to cut it off there. And if I would, do you want to answer one more question, Mary? Yes.
Okay, well,
La dernière.
thank you very much for an extraordinary story. But I wondered, as I was thinking, oh my God, anyone can use this text to mean anything. Anyone can say, I am the Indian and they are the Spaniards. So I was thinking that one final chapter to your story that would have been interesting, and I wondered if you had looked and then just not found it, would have been to see if it was published in New England by presses who were publishing abolitionist literature a little later than 1820. Did you look?
I stay, like for the cat, the 7 Lives was the last one. And so I have not looked. But I think the same kind of analysis could be done after 1820s, particularly in the context you mentioned, the abolitionists. Also, Las Casas was reused in the war between the United States and Spain, the War of Cuba, at the end of the 19th century. And so there are multiple reuses of Las Casas in a completely different context. But I have not studied this, but I think it would be really very, very interesting, because this was a very difficult question. I was very simplistic what I said. This question was raised since in the 18th century, in particular, I think first in the book by Depeau, and after by Robertson. When was used this mention in Herrera's Chronicle of this idea, I am not a specialist, but what Las Casas could have in mind was this form of domestic slavery which existed in all the cities of Spain, Portugal, Italy, in which was not a slave for plantation, it was slave in the ordinary life. And so he has this in mind. He was in mind also the idea that to suppress the encomienda and to relieve, in a certain sense, this population more and more extincted, you have to find some labor force. I don't want to make, like the Abbé Grégoire, a plaidoyer for Las Casas. It's not an historical task, but you have to reconstruct in what context he was thinking about this. And after, of course, it was denounced. And it's the reason why I think there is no re-edition in the 18th century, or quite not, of the text. The sixth life is late 17th century. And I suppose if the people are used Las Casas, I think Reynal was ambiguous, because Reynal was also quoted by Llorente as someone accusing Las Casas of being given the foundation for the slave trade. At the same time, Reynal is the first one in the Histoire des Deux Mondes to imagine a statue for Las Casas. I think an interesting topic would be the different presence of this immaterial statue, not only in Llorente, in the mere retreat, but also the first to say this is Reynal. And so I suppose the context of the abolitionism, if they are interested in reform Las Casas, would be really very, very important and interesting. And you can, I don't know, you can use Las Casas differently according upon what aspect you put the emphasis. But no, I suppose the library like in Philadelphia, the Franklin's library company would have a lot of material about this question. But to arrive in 1822 was sufficient for...
Well, it's also the cutoff point, more or less, for our collection. So you've done well. You've also given a lot of prospective applicants for fellowships at the John Carter Brown Library some great ideas for future research projects. I do want to say that although we didn't have a mini exhibition of Las Casas, we do have the exhibition that was curated by Ken Ward, Printer's Devils and Printer's Delights, that is located over here with a couple of satellite cases on either side of this. So we encourage you during the reception to take a look at what he's presented and to join us for a drink, and join me in thanking Roger Chartier for a phenomenal lecture.